Hi, my name is Samar Abbas. I'm going to show you how to write workflow as code using Go SDK for Temporal. So let's get started. I'm starting with an empty repository to cover few of the prerequisites. I already have Go set up on this machine. I'm going to be using VS Code as the IDE with the right Go setup. And I already have Temporal Docker server running in the background. Let's first initialize Go modules for the project. Open it up in VS Code. First thing you want to do is create an application to host workflow and activity implementations. For that, create like the main.go file. Create the main function. At this point, let's add the dependency uh, to the temporal Go SDK. You can do that by running go get command or go.temporal.io/temporal. This installs the temporal SDK. Temporal uses Zap logging. So let's first initialize the Zap logger that we are going to use to spin up a temporal client. We use tally for all our metric needs. So next, use the tally and create like a no-op scope, which we can use to bootstrap the client. Next step is to create the temporal client, which knows how to talk to the server in the background. So we provide like an API new client on the temporal SDK. The things that you need to initialize a client is the host port that the client needs to connect to the server. As part of the client SDK, we provide a default host port, which knows how to connect to the server running on your local machine. When you start the server, it automatically creates like a default domain, and the client exposes like a default domain name constant, which knows how to use the default domain for your client. Use the no-op scope that we initialized above to initialize the matrix scope as the client option. That's all you need to create a service client. The next step is to initialize the temporal worker, which takes in the service client that we initialized above. It also needs the name of the task list, which it listens on for any workflow and activity tasks. And then you specify the ZAP logger, which was initialized above in the worker options. And that's all which is needed to create a worker. Now let's create your workflow and activity implementations. Let's create a workflow method by the name of my workflow. Temporal workflow are just like any other Go functions. The only thing is it needs to have workflow.context as the first parameter and should return an error. Now let's create like an activity implementation. by the name of my activity. My activities are also like any other Go function, which takes a regular Go context and then returns an error in this case. Now, the next thing is let's add these activities and workflows to the worker that we just created. Using the register workflow API provided by the worker, you can register the workflow function that we just created below. And now in a similar way, use the register activity function to register the activity that we created below. Now both the workflow and activities are registered with the temporal worker. Now all you need to do is call start on the worker, which start connects to the temporal service and start listening for tasks. And just block this application so we know the process doesn't end. That's it. Now that's all which is needed to host your workflows and activities in a temporal worker, which is connected to the temporal server running in the background. Now let's try to run this application. So we can see the worker is started and listening on this task list that we provided. Just to make sure the application is running correctly, you can run the Docker TCT, the temporal CLI, which we provide by the name of TCTL, and try to describe the task list. And then you can see that there is one worker which is connected successfully with the server. So that's all which was needed to host a temporal workflow and activity and host it in a worker process. Now let's try to convert this application into a real application. What we are going to do is like write a greetings workflow, which calls two activities, get user, which returns the name of a user, and then send greeting, which sends a greeting to that user. So let's create a folder to put all our activities, implementations, and then another folder to put our workflows. Let's start with the activities. Define a get user.go file. And then in this file, define an activity get user. This activity does not return, takes any parameters and returns a string or error. Then modify, let's return temporal, that's the name of the user, and nil as error. That's it. You have a get user activity. Now create another file for send greeting activity. It's called, just define a function called send greeting. This activity takes user as a parameter. And then for now, all it does is just prints a message. greeting sent to user. That's it. So now we have both our activities defined. Now let's write the greetings workflow, which uses these two activities that we just defined. Create the greetings.go file. Define the workflow method. Let's call it greetings. As you can see, the workflow method takes workflow.context as the first parameter. The very first thing you want to do is create your activity options. So the way you create activity options is use the workflow.activity options API. There are two mandatory options: schedule to start. Let's set that to scheduled 1 hour, and start to close. Let's set this one to be also 1 hour. And then you use the with activity options API to set these options on the workflow context. Next step is let's schedule our first activity, which is get user. This activity does not take any parameter but returns a result which we are reading in the user variable. Then let's schedule the next activity, send greeting, which takes one parameter, and we are going to pass the result of first activity as input to the second one. Then we use the get API, although this activity does not return any result, but just to wait for the second activity to complete. At this point, when both activities are done, the workflow is finished. So let's print a message. Greetings workflow complete. And then let's tag the log with the user that this greeting was sent to. That's it. At this point, we have the greetings workflow, which calls two activities sequentially. Now let's go back to our worker. Let's remove these dummy activities that we created before and then replace it with the new one. Register the greetings workflow. Now register the two activities, get user and send greeting. That's it. Now the worker is hosting the new workflows and activities that we just created. Let's try to run this application. You can see the worker is now correctly started. And let's try to start a greetings workflow using TCTL library that we just provided. Then use the workflow start command for TCTL. This starts the workflow, and if it returns a run ID, which means the workflow greetings is successfully started. Now if you go back to the worker, you can see the greetings workflow was started successfully. It scheduled the first activity, get user, and after the first activity was completed, it scheduled the second send greeting activity, and which printed our message, and then the workflow completed successfully. You can go back, use the TCTL to list your workflow executions. And you can also run the show workflow show command to look at the history for that workflow. So this demonstrates that how easy it is to write like a simple workflow using Temporal. I hope this was useful for you. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.